My name is Dr. Rick Seguil.
And action. Hey, Jay had a... This is Kirk again. And action. Hey everyone, Taz had a question about hiking and insects, specifically ticks. So if this is the first time you're finding me, don't forget to hit the subscribe button down below and the alert button to find out when I do new videos. So ticks are a big pain. Now, the big problem is going to be getting bitten by the Lyme tick. So this is my friend that I picked up when I did a previous video on walking for health. So I was honestly, just for the video, I didn't do a full hike. I probably spent about 45 minutes to an hour. And I didn't go through tall grass. I didn't go through brush. 2 weeks later, I see this thing. Actually, 2 weeks later, I was putting moisturizer on my back, and I see a mole. And that's a different mole. I mean, the mole was like that big. So this picture doesn't do justice. So I pulled the mole off, and it was this, and that's my skin and blood vessels. Pretty gross. But, so I did what any hiker would do. I sent off for blood tests, and obviously I sent the thing off, and unfortunately, so that's what you would always do. My first suggestion is if you do find a tick, try to take it off, and you can find videos on how to take things off properly. But this is the little, so that right there, that sends Ixodes. Ixodes is the tick that carries Lyme disease. So I would usually check three things. I would check something called Ehrlichia, negative. I would check Babesia, just so you can see how I spell these things. Babesia. I would check Bartonella. It should be Bartonella, I think, right? And Lyme. So I checked all three, but unfortunately, I've got 4 serotypes for Lyme. You have to have 5, according to the CDC, to be positive for Lyme disease. I'm not going to wait for the 5th one to show up. So I did what any doctor would do, self-prescribe. So I did doxycycline. Where can you see this? I don't know if you can see that there. That's doxycycline right there. Usually doxycycline will be pretty decent at killing the intracellular expression of Lyme, or the spirochete. You can read more on spirochetes. But more for Taz, the objective. So that's my story. However, and I did come prepared, so I can't show you my garb. I usually will wear a couple of different layers. I try to tuck in the socks, or at least tighten up the ankles, so that if anything does crawl up, and this was on my back, like right here. So it had to go from my boot up the clothing into my shirt and bite my back. I'm like, wow. So unfortunately, about 40% of the people who do have Lyme, and that's where this talk is going to get to, they don't remember being bitten by a tick, and they won't have a rash. The typical erythema chronicum migrans rash of Lyme. I've had 2 patients with the disease. One that I found, and it looked like a typical bullseye. The other I took over, and he kept on getting antibiotics and steroids every time he had this psoriatic or eczematous outbreak for about 10 years. And I said, you know, that doesn't look like eczema, and you're using too much steroids. So I did a Lyme test. It came back negative, but I sent him to a Lyme proficient or Lyme literate infectious disease doctor, and he said it's Lyme. And you don't have to always hit all the magic numbers. In fact, there is a doctor out of New York, Dr. Horowitz, and he has this pretty decent questionnaire that he goes through to figure out who has highest risk for Lyme disease, and that is the Horowitz questionnaire, HMQ. It's Horowitz Lyme MSIDS questionnaire, and those are some of the questions that you have to get, and depending on the numbers, if you're like more than 63, high probability. Most likely that you have Lyme. So listen, if you do get bitten, well, let's talk about prevention first. This is what I usually spray on my clothing. It's permethrin. It sits for about 3 cycles of clothing wash. But if you spray it, it does repel, it irritates the insect. It shouldn't it's only on the outside, you have to let it dry overnight, but it shouldn't cause any carcinogenic change to your skin. But you can put it on your boots, you can put it on your socks, you can put it on your pants, your outer jackets. So it's important to have protection. Obviously I got this at, I think, REI. For mosquitoes, you have to worry about other diseases too. Mosquitoes, you can always use a mosquito net, so it kind of makes the hike a little bit more comfortable. Keep it in a backpack. Always have hydration. It's important to depict, just in case you get lost. Just in case you get bitten by a tick and you have Lyme brain and you can't get out of the woods, at least you'll have hydration. For scratches and itches, I always use peppermint oil. Peppermint oil is nice, it's evaporative, but it does help with decreasing the urge to scratch because you'll get secondarily infected. I have my botanical anti-mosquito sprays. My favorite one is this one, and I get this online. I did find this in Target though, and it has mostly herbs, a little bit of, majority is herbs, 90%, and then about a little bit of pea methane, but it's a lot better than DEET. So the only problem with this is that if you spray it on plastic, it will corrode the plastic. So I'm hoping it's just from the acids of the citrus. So if you do get a tick, pull it off properly, put it in a Ziploc bag, bring it to your doctor's office. As I showed you with the arthropod test earlier, it is positive for ixodes. Now that tick is a deer tick, and that's where Lyme comes from, on the back of white-tailed deers. The problem is the lab didn't check further to see if the deer tick carried the bacteria. So I'm guessing now. What I should have probably done is sent it to IGeneX. The only problem is, if you'll notice, the pricing on the IGeneX tests, kind of pricey. So, but they're probably the most accurate and efficient lab in the US, maybe in the world, that does full testing. Here's a cheap panel, which is pretty decent. You can get these order forms online. I think I had asked the company to send me out order forms, but you have to have these tests done in a certain amount of time. Here's some really expensive prices. So you can get that online, but that is more accurate than me, unfortunately, guessing. Now, as I mentioned to you with the HMQ, the questionnaire, sometimes you don't have to have a positive rash, a bullseye rash, or just a rash. You don't have to have the tick. Sometimes it's just chronic disease. And in the midst of this fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis kind of society, there are some Lyme specialists that say maybe it's that. So if you dive into the Lyme disease camp, it's almost like an epidemic. So you're going to go down a rabbit hole, because there's Lyme disease, there's resistant Lyme, there's something called persisters, which I believe it could be. So if I have somebody that has chronic fatigue, and I have a lot of fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue patients, I would probably dive into at least checking the standard tests. Going to IGeneX, I'd say only if it's high suspicion and if they don't pass the standard test. Standard because most insurances will cover it, and most labs locally will do it. Those fancy tests from IGeneX, that breaks down even the serotypes from Europe and Asia, or North America, Canada. So I think it's important to have a wide variety of different tests versus the standard. But again, standard is first line. If you're positive with standard and you have enough symptoms or a rash and positive tick bite, I'd say go ahead and treat. So first treatment of choice, I think, is easy, doxycycline. It does cause an upset stomach. It can cause gut dysbiosis because you wipe out, hopefully, the spirochete in its early stages before it turns cystic and a couple other things and invades, but you also wipe out your gut microbiota, and you're going to have to replenish. And I would take Doxy in the morning and at night, and I'd do a big probiotic in the daytime. So the big probiotic has to be close, upward of 100 billion. And there is something called VSL double strength number 3. I think I did a video on VSL in the past, so I'll put a link down below. You can't take the antibiotic with the probiotic, so you have to do the probiotic in the middle of the day. Hopefully that'll get you a little bit of reaccumulation of good gut bacteria, because you might wind up with IBS or maladaptive or malabsorption issues, so watch out for that. It's also important to go to the next stage, or at least see a Lyme specialist, because sometimes one round, which the standard I think is 3 weeks of doxy, which I don't know if that's enough. I would always worry about people who have persistence. In my case, I don't have any symptoms except for an unusual problem with my right toe, and then now a persistent problem with my left heel. So then comes the question of migrating joint pain. And if I do have somebody with fever, with chronic fatigue, migrating joint pain, and a rash, that's it. I'm going to test for those standards, and I might even go into the next level of hygienics. Because again, if you look at Horowitz's HMQ, I like the questionnaire. It lumps more possibilities into having Lyme as a persistence or undiagnosed, undetected infection. There's also other co-infections with Lyme, mycoplasma, chlamydia, and other diseases and other toxins. The book's pretty good if you can pick it up. It's a good read. It's again by Horowitz, but at least if you know that you might be able to avoid this kind of questionable disease and frustration just by using the protection I mentioned. And then most important too is to do, especially if you go hiking with other people, to do a skin check to find this little bugger and make sure you kill it before he gets to the point of embedding. Now, there's no way that he was this big. I said it was that big. There's no way he was that big when he climbed up. I would have felt him. So he'd been sucking. And I found this 2 weeks after I did that video. And I haven't been to the woods or forests in between. So he was getting engorged with my blood for 2 weeks. And nasty. So, number one, prevent. Number two, if you find it, seal it, send it off. And ask the lab to check for the specific saliva and bacteria inside the tick. Number three, if you're suspicious, get to the HMQ, take it, and then maybe get to a Lyme literate doctor. 4, beg, borrow, and steal and tell your doctor to try to consider coverage. Now, I hated antibiotics. I always bragged I haven't taken an antibiotic in about 12 to 13 years. This is the first time. Last time I tried for a sinus infection, I had a terrible infection secondary to the antibiotic in my gut. So, but I have had a couple of patients in my practice that are what are called persisters, and their lives aren't great. So I'm trying to get one over to Horowitz in New York. The other I'm using doctors local and in downtown Chicago. So it could be a problem, I'd say, for the risk versus benefits. I would treat until proven otherwise. Again, if you can prevent, then you should be okay. And walking around in tall grass, sometimes if you go to some trails, you have no choice. But if you can stick to not going between the brush, especially springtime, maybe late summer and fall, and sticking on paved gravel, that might be a little better for you. And again, most important, full skin, toe to head heel skin check after you get done, just to make sure that you can even start as a freckle. So you have to make sure that you wash clothing if you're suspicious. Usually putting the clothing in a dryer with high heat will kill the thing. It won't necessarily die with water or soap, but it's the high heat in the dryer. So prevention's the best. Awareness is second. And then if you do get it, don't be worried, but don't ignore it. Get it taken care of, or at least start it immediately, maybe get to a second opinion. So hopefully this helps, Tess. If any of you have had positive Lyme and you know somebody, a doctor that is Lyme proficient, please put a link down or to comment down below. Otherwise, don't forget to subscribe, push the alarm button or alert button, and I'll see you at the next clinic.